Now I'd like to welcome our Chief Executive, Paul Simshauser, to the stage. He makes my job as MC very easy, as he's very well known to you all and needs very little in the way of introduction, and I think quietly hates listening to me spruik his lengthy credentials every year. As always, Paul will be staying on stage after his presentation to take questions from the floor and also from our online attendees. Please join me in welcoming Paul to the lectern to share his State of the Network presentation this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Nicole. Can I just also start by acknowledging the traditional owners and the lands in which we gather, the Yagara and Turrbal, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. A couple of weeks ago, my daughter was standing in this very spot speaking to a room of 350 people, which is a bigger mob than I'd ever spoken to before, and she's been ribbing me non-stop ever since. Can't wait to get home tonight. All right, each year before I pull together the slide pack, and it's usually the Alan Kohler session on steroids, as you know, lots and lots of charts and data and all that sort of stuff. But this year, as I was pulling the pack together, I always sit down with our redoubtable GM of comms, Jerry Riley, and just talk through, the framing of it. And we were reflecting on energy as a foundation to the economy. And there's, when you think about sort of the really great gains in economic activity over the last 200 or 300 years, there's always been three industries that have been firing on all cylinders at that point in time, and they come down to communications, energy, and the transport industries. And why those three industries are significant is because the communications industry is how we manage economic activity. The energy industry is obviously how we power that economic activity, and the transport industry is how we move activity around, the economic activity around. And when those three industries all go through a great innovative change sort of simultaneously is when we have our great revolution, our industrial revolutions, and great gains in human welfare and standards of living and the things that we've got available to us on a day-to-day basis. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. 18th century Britain, you had the comms industry revolutionised through the steam printing press. All of a sudden we could mass produce information in a way that we'd never been able to do before in humankind. And not long after that, we had the telegraph. All of a sudden, we could communicate over vast distances. Almost simultaneously, we discovered coal. That was the first time we could really power stuff in a way that sort of started to reduce the labour component of production. And simultaneously, of course, you had the steam engine dropped on a bunch of rail lines. Rail. All of a sudden, we could move things around in a way that we could never have previously done at the speed, pace, and size. Dial the clock forward to 19th century United States. The same three industries came together again. So on the communications industry, all of a sudden we had the telephone. We could now communicate at the speed of light, bilaterally, and start to manage things in a way that we'd never done before. With energy, of course, it was the electricity grid. All of a sudden we had power at places, not only in manufacturing plants, but in the household, and the productivity and the gains that gave to sort of human life and commodities was almost endless. And then, of course, with transport, it was the internal combustion engine. All of a sudden, we weren't limited to rail lines. You could start to move things at different pace and scale and size around the economy. And that led to 80 years of sort of extraordinary growth in economies, in human welfare, and some of the records that were set over that 80-year window from, call it the 1880s through to about the 1970s still haven't been broken. The Boeing 707 still flies faster than anything in the air today, interestingly enough. And so when you think about where we are at the moment, there's this slight change to that analogy. That the three industries are still massively important in terms of managing and powering and moving economic activity around. But the big difference now is, so in communications, we've had the internet, we're moving to that AI and machine learning phase. In transportation, we know we'll start moving to, sort of electric vehicles or sort of hydrogen-fired machines. And then, of course, with electricity, it's renewables. That idea of, zero I know they're not free when you build them, but zero marginal cost generation gives some quite interesting prospects going forward. But the big difference now, of course, is that electricity underpins the other two industries because they won't be doing much without the electricity industry. And the sort of the key point of all this is what we do at Powerlink and what you do, in all of your development activities with our organisation really matters. It matters a lot. It's basically become the core strategy of the state of Queensland. When you think about that Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, which, it was by any measure, and I know Paul Martin and his team are here in the room today, it was absolutely a world-class piece of public policy and energy policy. There's a bunch of us on the exec team at Powerlink that have travelled the the breadth of the world over the last sort of 12 months, and everywhere we go, everyone's sort of in those foreign countries says, oh, wish we had one. It's a world-class piece of policy. It's also the core economic strategy of the Queensland government. There are lots of other strategies that go alongside that, but it actually underpins everything that the state will do. So what we do really matters. So that gets me onto investment. So let's go to the Alan Kohler session now. So first of all, our basic playbook for the network. You can see our existing network up there at the moment, the 275, 132, 330 kV backbone and associated lines. You'll see, I guess, the really important thing for us at the moment has been, really focusing on renewable energy zones. They actually create the requisite hosting capacity. I can tell you when you go and study any electricity market over the world, if you see booms and busts associated with renewable generation, it comes down to hosting capacity and curtailment rates. Curtailment being when you've got production exceeding line capacity or demand requirements. So they've been really important to us, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. Another thing that we're really focused on, of course, is strengthening that line into Gladstone, making sure that we know there's going to be a large number of electrification loads. Stuart Bell's going to turn up here later on with a really cool slide. And walk through just exactly what we're planning for that Gladstone region. It's going to be really important, whether you're on the demand or the supply side of our industry, it's going to be important going forward. It also has the benefit of opening up a couple of more renewable energy zones that we're very eager to go and pursue. We know that there are some excellent resources in the area. And then, of course, we've got the copper string. As the Minister mentioned, we had the delivery launch package earlier this week, which enables us to start to really chisel down what that project's going to look like going forward. And then from there we start swinging back down to the Barumba pumped hydro, connecting up to Gladstone, and then of course the Burdekin, Pioneer Burdekin scheme as well along the way. Just in terms, so that's the transmission playbook that we've got in the back of our minds, and I sort of always hasten to add, it's a point in time plan. We are constantly sort of torturing that plan internally. As we get new and better information, we've got the screwdrivers and spanners out, and we'll alter it as we need to. But at this stage, that's the current plan we've got. When you think about generation plant commitments, I've got up here the national electricity market history for 25 years, from when it started in 98 through to the 2023 fin year, and on the y-axis is megawatts. That first wave was coal. You can see the gas wave, and then of course the renewable investment supercycle, as Joel Gilmore and I often refer to it as. And interestingly enough, an increasing number of firming capacity coming through the turnpike as well. I've got obviously Snowy 2.0 up there, Gen X, and a bunch of, an increasing number of batteries. I'm sure some of you can't help but have noticed the most recent piece of work put out by Rystad. Queensland has the most volatile power market in the world. It means it's a great place to do battery and storage projects. Shouldn't surprise you. We've got lots of solar, so it's a good place to be. Looking at those numbers there, you'd sort of wonder about, over the last 6 months, there's been a lot of media on, the whole market grinding to a halt, right? Look at those numbers there, you wouldn't know it, but let me just do a quick trick for you. I'm just going to shake the numbers a bit, move them all forward by 6 months, and drop this exact same data into calendar year format. So you'll notice there, 2016 to 2023, 193 projects, 29,000 megawatts of plant, $63 billion across the East Coast, across the national electricity market. So let's go and do the same thing by calendar year. So it's the same data, that same 63 billion. And you see there 2023 really has been a bit of an unusual year by calendar year standards. The last time we saw investment this low was actually back in 2015. And all the renewable developers in the room know well what was going on in 2015, right? So it's a bit of an indictment if that's where we're at. But I think we all know what's happened over the course of the last 12 months. There's been a bit of sticker price shock for PPAs. We know there's sort of, the cost of equipment. I can tell you the cost of, transformers and so on has sort of, certainly made us balk. I know that's been the same with turbines and panels and so on. System strength has sort of reared in places, and I know projects have sort of stubbed their toes a bit on that, and we're doing our best to work through that with those proponents. But at the same time too, that we've got good reason to feel like the bases are loaded here in Queensland, and I'll walk you through a little bit what I mean by that. There is obviously lots of batteries going on at the moment too. They're sort of seeming to navigate well, but we're confident the renewables will roar back to life. The one thing we're just trying to navigate at the moment, I just want to give you just a couple of quick snapshots on supply chain constraints that we see on the transmission side. So circuit breakers, pretty important piece of equipment if you're wanting to connect a renewable generator to the grid. Historically 44 weeks before COVID, just started to rise up to, getting close to 18 months, almost 2 years, but most recently it's looking like it's becoming a very tough part of the market. You've got people all over the world trying to do this all at once, and you can see those lead order times really blowing out. That's got big implications for us as an organisation. We're starting to, we've shifted some time back to a completely different inventory strategy, knowing full well what our customers are going to need from us, the generation developers. I'll just give you those same numbers again. So there's our lead order time for circuit breakers. I'll just show you, I'm hoping we don't need one of these, but if we did, a 500 kV phase shifting transformer right now, if you want one by 2030, you better get your checkbook out today, because that's how far out they're booked in. And of course, that's largely driven by economic activity in the renewable space in Europe. All of a sudden, they're needing to redirect power flows in ways they haven't had to previously. Another headwind that I think most of us have been got eyes on all over, of course, community social licence. And one of the key metrics that we try and keep a very close eye on to gauge our how we're tracking as an organisation is the media count. So the number of times the words social licence, community engagement, energy, and Queensland and Powerlink turn up in a newspaper article. And there's a lot. Over the last 12 months, 2,400 articles, right? But I want to just put that into perspective for you. Our organisation has done a massive amount on that front, and we've recut our landowner payment schemes. There's no question it's the best in the country. No question at all. It's fairer. It includes neighbouring payments. It's got overall probably a slightly higher return to those customers. I'm just an interesting stat for you. We've done 2,000 kilometres of transmission line over the last 20 years. We've never stopped. The other states had big gaps in their programs. We've just been doing it non-stop up here. So, our teams, they do know what Facebook's up to, they've been growing up with all that. It's not a surprise to them. And I think probably the other really interesting metric for me is, over the last 7 years, we've had to traverse 180 properties. Some of those are very, very big cattle stations. I'm sure you can all imagine, in a state like ours. Out of those 180 properties, on one occasion did we need to use powers of acquisition. The other 179 were all just deals that were done. So we've got this. And look, there's those numbers from Queensland, the 2,400 media mentions over the last 12 months. Here's the rest of the NEM. So, when you see all that noise, it's primarily sort of happening, sort of south of the Tweed, where it is. I don't focus on as much. I'm obviously laser focused on Queensland, but in relative terms, we're tracking okay. When I talk about the bases being loaded, you go straight to the lead indicators. So lead indicators for renewable developments, well, first of all, DAs, right? You want to know that you've got enough wind and solar projects that have got their DAs in the pipe. So it's an important lead indicator. You can see here on the y-axis gigawatts, and of course the black lines are showing you the targets that New South Vic and Queensland need. So New South Wales has been a bit patchy in terms of its DAs. Victoria's got a bit of a worrying trend. Queensland consistently year on year is hitting the numbers. So from a lead indicator perspective, that's promising, right? The other thing I know is the impact that good policy has. I mentioned before QEJP being a world-class piece of energy policy, and again, no question about that. And let me just give you some evidence. So in the 12 months prior to the QEJP being released, we had about 26 projects, 8,500 megawatts of renewables, sitting in the inquiries phase of our overall connections queue. That being construction, sort of application inquiry, early engagement, and so on. Here's the numbers 12 months after. So we went from 8,500 to 35,000 megawatts of projects in the inquiries phase. That's a big change. And it shows you what good policy, clear policy, clarity of what a state economy wants to do can actually have on investors in the investor market. I guess when I think about the other really important lead indicator for us, again, I go back to network hosting capacity. So whenever you see those booms and busts in marketplaces, the booms are preceded by, sort of anticipatory transmission network hosting capacity, and the busts are preceded by gradually rising levels of renewables spill, renewables curtailment, unable to access markets because the lines are full or it's oversupplied relative to market demand. So for that reason, and look, Exhibit A, the best place to go and really study the form guide on that, just go and read the ERCOT story in Texas, because they've been doing this now for 15 years and, they've got, tens of thousands of megawatts of wind, and you can follow those booms and busts, preceded by the renewable energy zones. They pioneered these things. So in our case, unsurprisingly at Powerlink, this has been a laser-sharp focus for us. So we've got 3 in flight at the moment, as you read, up in the north, southern and western downs. And the thing I draw you to now, there's network capacity. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference between network capacity and renewable plant capacity in a res later on. But the thing I'd just sort of point out about our renewable energy zones, first of all, they're merchant. We're taking the risk on. We keep it out of the regulatory asset base, so they end up being sort of co-funded by ourselves and connecting generators, and that's where the user charges flow. Because they're merchant, they're lightning quick. Right, we don't need to go through RIT-T processes or anything like that. We just go do them. By the way, I've got a board I've got to convince first, but they're up for the Pepsi challenge. That's been the practical evidence of the board of Powerlink. Super low capital cost because we're doing radials. We're finding really good spots on our long network. It's been a complex network for eons. All of a sudden, it's our biggest advantage. So we find these sweet spots in the network, and we build a radial off the backbone. So low capital cost, and of course we've been doing some pretty innovative financings. My sort of history in prior lives has sort of turned out to be pretty useful, and Darryl and I have cooked up all sorts of crazy financings, but they've been great, and we've passed 100% of the benefit of that on to the connecting generators. We don't house any of that benefit ourselves. And they're divisible. If we can get comfortable with the risk, we will salami slice the charges and go in with an undersubscribed renewable energy zone where the generators are paying only their roughly or approximate relevant share. But the most important thing, look at the cycle times. So the first 3 that we did, somewhere between 3 years and 4 years from the moment we finished drawing lines on a whiteboard to energisation. Now I'll just sort of remind you of the poor old tortured Central West Orana res. It was on the whiteboard in 2019. I understand it'll be energised in 2028. It's 9 or 10 years cycle time. That's very normal globally, by the way. It's what it takes in Germany, Great Britain, the United States and so on. But we are capable of moving quickly here. The only caveat I'd put around that at the moment is, as all of you are now discovering, when we have to delve into the world of the EPBC Act approvals, you can add on 2 years to those numbers, of course. Maybe some of it we can run in tandem, but mostly it is slowing a lot of us all down. So when you put all that in a mixing bowl, what does our sort of pipeline look like? Well, what's on the ground? You can see there the wind and the solar projects all appearing on screen, the batteries. So 32 projects, 5,700 megawatts, on the ground or under construction. 52 applications right now, 19,000 megawatts. I tell you, every time I go and see Sachin Goyal, he's pretty busy. His team are juggling 40 534 A and B application processes at any one point in time. They're one of the busiest teams in the country. I should add too, we have the largest connections engineering teams in Australia. In fact, I wouldn't mind betting from here to a hill post, if you added up our 3 southern rivals, we've probably got more than all of them put together because we're that busy. And there's another 100,000 megawatts in the pipe, in those sort of, early engagement and development stage, very early development stages. So, the bases to us look like they're reasonably well set. What do we need going forward? This chart just gives you what we would think by sort of roughly 2032. You can see the technologies along the bottom there: wind, solar, and batteries and pumped hydro and gas turbines. That's what's on the ground, and it's around about $14 billion worth of commitments or operational plant. In terms of under construction, nearing what we would call financial close, when we look down our pipeline at the moment, the team are currently thinking there's almost 2,800 megawatts worth of projects that we think are capable of hitting financial close in the next 12 months. But then, as you go into the inquiry and early development stages, the pleasing thing for us is those bars are meeting the lines for the first time since I've been dialing this chart out. There had been gaps previously on some of the firming capacity, but not anymore. We can see the other thing I'll just point to too, that wind, 30,000 megawatts there on that bar. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. All right, enough on investment. Let me walk through prices. As always, start at the beginning. natural gas. So this is quarterly data, March 2011 through to the most recent quarter, September 2023. It's a chart that Joel Gilmore and I have been sort of updating with monotonous regularity. The gas on the right hand side y-axis in dollars per gigajoule, you can see very clearly the impact of the Ukraine war. Here's the electricity price, and I can assure you it's gas driving electricity, not the other way around. In fact, any of you ever thought about getting a licence for one of those great big, price forecasting models? Don't. Let me show you a quick party trick. $11 fixed plus 8 times the gas price. So here we go. Here's that electricity price from the previous chart, right? Here is $11 plus 8 times gas price. Ta-da! There you go. Don't worry about the forecasting models. Just take that formula. You'll be good as gold. You can run your whole business off it. All right, forward prices are, of course, mean reverting. What do I mean by mean reverting? It means when prices are up, people build stuff and bring prices down. When prices go down, they're down too low, someone loses money, they turn off. So here's our sort of new entrant forward curve or cost curve from back in 2005 when we had started getting really good forward market data. You can see the spot prices, and those forward prices are always pulling towards where entry costs are perceived to be. And you can see the current forward curves, the last two up there, bang on where those numbers are. I suppose the key thing I'd flag there is, particularly for the consumer reps in the room, those forward numbers are actually drifting up. They're not where they used to be. Those sticker price shocks, they're not going away anytime soon. And the things that we see through our supply chain make us think they'll stick around for a while. The IRA Act is about to start having its impact on supply chains, so we know that's going to keep pressure on markets for some time to come. What that means for the bulk supply price, here's Powerlink's charges right from the day the place was spun out of the QEC all the way through to our forecast of 2027, and you can see that where we think that the next couple of years of forward prices will be measured on that y-axis. So then, what would that mean for households? We've got a forecast of household residential prices inside Powerlink that we run. There's the last sort of 70 years worth or 75 years worth of data. Last year the prices were big increases. If you're down here in southeast Queensland, the numbers were 18-20% increase. If you're out in the regions, it was 28% or so. Our preferred way of measuring a two-part tariff means you've got to make a decision on denominator or household consumption. We use a slightly different measure for that than the QCA does. We sort of thought that the prices increased by about 30% last year, 32%. We think on this metric they'll go down by 16%. Now we've factored in a pretty volatile old summer. If it goes completely nuts, this will be wrong. But if it's just that expected level of volatility that we're all anticipating over the course of the coming summer, that'll be a reduction in household electricity tariffs by something. Probably the QCA's numbers would be 10 or 12%. Ours are probably 15-16%. But that's a big drop, and it's good to see, of course. Why is that so important? I always put this chart up, whether it's an internal presentation or an external one. When I'm talking to people from our industry, we need to be ever mindful of how aggressive our commodity is. So on that bottom axis there, we've got household income after housing costs. After housing costs, I don't know about you, I've never had much luck negotiating with banks or landlords, so consider that the largest claim, what's left, and then what of that income is being spent on electricity. And the average is about 2%. But you can see here for there's 400,000 households, which in Queensland you define as low economic resource. That means not only have they got low income, they've also got very low assets. So their bandwidth to deal with price shocks is extremely minimal. And you can see in amongst this 400,000 households here in Queensland, that there's, in the current year, 248,000 of them would otherwise meet a definition of fuel poverty. 11.6% of Queenslanders would meet a definition of fuel policy based on those price spikes from last year. Now, a bit of magic from the Department of Energy and Public Works and managing to sort of grab a big part of the Queensland fiscal accounts. They've managed to move that number down to 117,000 through the package they put through last year for concession card holders and all households. In fact, that particular package was so significant it actually moved the national accounts of Queensland. The rest of the country had a quarterly inflation rate of about 1.2%. Here in Queensland, it was 0.7% because of that package that went out to Queensland households. So it was quite an extraordinary piece of public policy, but you can't keep doing that every year. It works while you've got, the sort of the fiscal position we're in, but it's unsustainable. The best thing we can all do is bring those power prices back down, and that means making sure we're getting the investment flowing. It's so important. Speaking of investment flowing, so renewable energy network capacity versus renewable capacity. I want to just sort of talk through this a little bit just to make sure everyone understands the nuance or the difference between a renewable energy zone network capacity and what we believe would be renewable plant capacity in a zone. There are three reasons why there's a difference between those two numbers. The first is there's a degree of complementarity between wind and solar resources in Queensland. We also know that the peak to average of wind plants are actually sort of quite high, as distinct from solar, and also too our non-firm access regime in the NEM is actually pretty valuable. I know you may not think it, but I'm going to walk you through why that's the case, particularly by comparison to a priority access regime. First of all, wind and solar. So if you picked on Southern Downs last year, I'll use Western Downs this year. So solar, there's solar, 800 odd megawatts worth. That's its diurnal pattern in summer on average. Here's the wind on average in summer. So they're at its face, they're pretty complementary. Now on that chart there, by the way, their simple correlation is minus 0.7. Now, of course, in 30-minute data, that disintegrates down to minus 0.29, so it's a lot more complex than that, but nonetheless, they are, in the aggregate, complementary. So there's opportunities to squeeze a lot. If you imagine 1,000 megawatt transmission line, clearly you can get way more than 1,000 megawatts of wind and solar into that transmission line based on those sort of patterns. The other thing is too, I mentioned about that peak to average production ratios of wind. So if you just take a standard 275 kV transmission line, double circuit, 150 kilometres from the coast, its summer rating's probably around, 1536 megawatts, but let's call it 1500 megawatts, and close to 1900 in winter, and the temperatures being the key difference there. So what does a wind farm look like? Well, if you've got a 1500 megawatt transmission line and you're prepared to accept, imagine a wind farm with a 35% capacity factor and you were prepared to be curtailed by 1%, you could shove 1880 megawatts into that, and that's based on 5 years of historic data. You'll lose, on average, less than 1% capacity factor a year. So you'll always build more wind than the nameplate of the transmission line. By the way, if you take that transmission line and put a whole bunch of little weather stations along the lower spans and feed the real-time data back to our control room and work out how to do a dynamic rating, that's what it looks like. It's got that nice, because the wind will cool the lines down a bit. Once wind speeds get over 3 metres a second, it kind of the cooling effect maxes out. But once you get over 3 metres a second, wind turbines start, right? So you should expect, of course, you'd be able to, in theory, squeeze a lot more wind into the exact same infrastructure. Just with a little bit of help from the BOM and a bunch of very clever OT engineers. I'll put to one side the sort of rather obvious system security risk that might present when you have a line. I'm looking at Maren York down there going, so it's all right, man, we've got that one under control. We won't do it yet. And then, of course, if you think about those, what could you ideally or optimally put into a 1500 megawatt renewable energy zone summer rating when the wind maxes out as its highest? So there's our summer line and here's our winter line. If you were trying to maximise production, if you could play central planning god, that's what you'd put in. So you'd actually layer in about 1700 megawatts of wind, 580 megawatts of solar, and that's got no curtailment or very little curtailment. If you're prepared to take a 1% capacity factor, you can squeeze that up to 1,700. If you're prepared to go out to 1.8, and all those numbers are probably bankable, most developers would tell me. So, for a 1,500 megawatt renewable energy zone, you can actually fit a lot in there. The other thing that is really important to understand is the way that our connection regimes and our dispatch regimes work. Let's assume everyone bids at zero, so we take that out of the equation for a moment. What's the curtailment rates when you start oversupplying? So now I'll flip the axes around. Bottom axis has wind capacity in megawatts, and we've got the capacity factor, the annual capacity factor of the wind. So we're going to start at 35%, meaning a 100 megawatt wind farm, on average, would produce 35 megawatt hours across the year. But it'll, of course, range from 0 to 100, as you know. As you start layering more and more wind in on a non-firm access regime, which the NEM has, that curtailment is shared. So the spill, the overproduction or the line congestion, the impacts of it are shared across all of the incumbents. And you can see here, that up until our sweet spot of 2200, it ends up being about a 1% capacity factor impact. But if you go to a rank order, a priority access regime, it completely changes the metrics altogether. In actual fact, each individual megawatt that comes on after the other wears the full brunt of whatever access regime is left, access is left. Does that make sense? So that marginal megawatt, understanding that is really important. You can see here if we were in that particular scenario on a priority basis, the final megawatt, where that green line intersects the two lines, on the blue line, it's the solid blue line, it's intersecting at 34% capacity factor. You can actually bank 2,200 megawatts of wind on that basis. You go down that blue path, yes, it's true, the first wind farms away would have unfettered access, they'd never experience any constraints, and they'd be right for the term at which they've got that priority. But for every wind farm that follows, they're going to be dealing with the residual of what's left over. And let me assure you, in the current environment, a 25% capacity factor wind farm is completely unbankable. Now, if you were the first entrant into that particular renewable energy zone, you'd be feeling pretty good about life. But I wouldn't mind betting your next project, your third or fourth in the queue in the next renewable energy zone, it's not going to help you at all. You're going to find yourself all of a sudden with stranded assets. And it actually goes through, the numbers in the market support this as well. So here's sort of, what the average cost, and I've just calibrated against a roughly $73 wind farm as an entry price or the PPA price. And you can see as you build more and more wind under that non-firm regime we've got, it's a very gentle upward sloping curve because that curtailment is shared, the pain's shared equally, in the res behind the res constraints. Granted, there'll be others downstream, but this is just focusing on the res. Take 5 years' worth of historic spot price data only, exclude the LGCs, just spot prices from 2017 to 21. I've stripped out 22 because the numbers were too big. You can see that actually the market would support a little bit more than that maximised production, so to actually support a bit more curtailment. If we went down that path of the rank order, the priority dispatch, that's what your entry cost curve looks like. And it means that to get the same amount of megawatts on the ground, you're going to have an increase in consumer prices of about $20 a megawatt hour. And of course, the market tells you, actually, that's not what you'll do. You'll just actually develop, 700 megawatts less renewable, 5 and whatever it is, 600 megawatts less renewables, which would mean we'd need to produce more or develop more renewable energy zones. I think we all know how difficult that's going to be. So it's really important as we're thinking through policy reforms in our industry right now, we stay eyes on. There's a lot to like about our non-firm access regime. There's a lot of things about it which have helped tremendously in our industry. One of Powerlink's stated objectives has always been to guide the market, but I just want to remind everyone in the room that we are not smarter than the market. And I want to give you 4 examples of what that looks like. We said our first renewable energy zone will be at Western Downs. Now, we got the job done, but actually it was third. The market wanted to move faster in other locations than we did. We need to be ever mindful of what the market wants from us and not dictate the other way around. We thought the market was trending underweight wind. We were actually getting a bit worried about it. And you saw that pipeline, right, 30,000 megawatts, so we really got that one wrong too. We thought that we needed to undertake we started getting really worried about minimum loads. And so we felt we needed to take an EOI battery to try and stimulate a bit of interest and activity in the market. Sachin Goyal and his team are currently dealing with 3,500 megawatts of batteries trying to get 534A and B letters right now. We also thought synchronous condensers were going to be too big for projects and that we'd need to somehow centrally coordinate them on behalf of renewable developers. What we didn't see was the innovation coming with batteries. Grid-forming batteries actually starting to virtually eliminate the need for synchronous condensers in some case, or the fact that renewable projects were getting so big, ticket size on their opening, that they were well within their own capacity to do it themselves. So the one thing I'd sort of really try to emphasise to all of you in the room here today, there's a lot of Powerlink people in the room. They're here to listen very carefully. It's how we get our information. It's how we make sure we road test what we're thinking, what we're planning to make sure we don't stuff this up. And I can assure you, we listen very carefully to all the players that are, connecting to our grid or have got some sort of involvement either in policy or activity on either side of our supply demand side of our dynamics. Now, just finally, I'm going to finish up on this slide. A number of you in the room have been living the dream in our beloved industry for a long time. And usually when you sort of sit down, put them down on a couch, say, tell me about life, they'll say, the policy uncertainty, it's killing me. I just thought I'd give you some evidence as to why it's actually pretty serious, right? They're right. They're right to say this. So let me just show you the beloved energy trilemma: affordability, security, and decarbonisation. So let me take you on the journey we've all been on over the last 25 years. First of all, we started the national electricity market in 1998. That was all about affordability. You all remember that? We had the whole bunch of overbuilt net systems. We then sort of went down to our towards that centre there we had the world's first renewable energy target. Did you know that? So the idea of renewable portfolio centres came out of the United States, but Australia was the first jurisdiction in the world to develop a renewable target. And in addition to that, Queensland was the first one to do a banded scheme which involved gas. We then had the 2004 summer, so the blackouts here in Brisbane, and simultaneously pretty much in Sydney, totally unrelated reasons, but they both led to the same outcome: security. We then had our 2008 election, actually it was 2007, but in 2008 we turbocharged the renewable target to 20%. We also started seeing feed-in tariffs for rooftop, and of course we introduced the carbon price. Not long after that, we had another election and we got rid of the carbon price. And we also had the AER come out with the blowtorches. Over that period of time, we were sort of checking the numbers yesterday with Jenny Harris, our head of reg. We did a quick scan of all the regulated utilities across the east coast of Australia. It was systematic. When you put in your OPEX, you had 10% cut off. Put in your CAPEX, you had 28% cut off. That was the average across the entire eastern seaboard. And then, of course, we had the 2016 blackout, so we went deep into security mode at that point. Alan Finkel tried to bring us back towards the centre, did as good a job as he can. Then we got to that sweet spot, that renewable super cycle, 2018 to 2021. That was when the renewable projects crashed through the sound barrier. They undercut the marginal cost of existing coal and gas-fired generation. It was a pretty interesting moment. COP26 told us we weren't moving fast enough, and then we had the Ukraine war. But I do believe you guys, that Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, honestly, it is as a piece of public policy, as an energy policy of all the things, and I've seen these things come and go in my working career. I've never seen a job that's been done so well. So a big shout out to all of our Depew colleagues in the room here. It is truly a world-class piece of public policy, and we hear that wherever we go in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Always great to hear firsthand your thoughts and, more importantly, your predictions about where you see us headed. Paul's slides will be available on Powerlink's website later today, so your grainy iPhone photo, if it doesn't work, you'll be able to get it from our website. So Paul has a microphone in his hand, so you can all take the opportunity to ask some questions. We'll have roving mics for those in the room and a reminder about the Ask button on the screen for those that are online. I might start with online, mainly so I don't forget to ask those questions. So Paul, what's been the response overseas to how Queensland is transforming its power system?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of things spring to mind. I recently did a trade mission with the Premier to Japan and South Korea. It was interesting, the majority of the conversations, you can imagine we're in rooms full of, those extraordinarily large companies that characterise those two countries. In every hour meeting, I would have said that 45 minutes of it was about the QEJP, and their interest in, what Queensland is capable of doing. They all know and love Queensland. They're long-standing trading partners with us. I mean, Japan has long been our biggest trader. I know they go up and down on the Australia scale, but for Queensland, they're a huge. But we've got long connections, and of course they know and envy the resources we have, and of course they need. So it's a big deal. They all know it, and they had a lot of questions about it when I got up there. I know, I was just reflecting on Stuart Bell, our head of a high priest of network planning and so on. Stuart was, not that long ago up in Great Britain, Scotland, England and a few other places, and he was quite often asked about it. And his reflections on it, on the conversations he had was, as he'd sort of talk through what it comprised, as a, our playbook going forward, they'd sort of, you'd hear this sigh, sort of, I wish we had one, and that was pretty common. I don't know, I've had very similar conversations in other parts of Europe, and Gary Edwards over in the United States as well. So it's well known, right?
Thanks, Paul. Anything in the room? Any questions? Otherwise, I'll jump back online. Henry. Wait for the microphone, Henry. I know we could hear you, but wait for the microphone, can you?
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Paul, you alluded to it in some of the comments you made earlier, but with the developments we're seeing down south, the challenges that are emerging. So we saw Snowy 2 on Four Corners recently, and so I'm just wondering, Powerlink are going to encounter some of these challenges. You seem to have been able to get over some of the hurdles, but getting news releases of delays to projects or changes to projects is probably not good for investment. Would Powerlink be willing to consider a development of, say, a portal on some of these major projects? You've got the super grid, etc., and providing regular updates, not just limited to the tapper, because the tappers are one point, in time, but indicating where critical paths have suddenly emerged that weren't anticipated, etc., providing that information to the industry, so it's, we're not waiting on rumours or hearsay or whatever and waiting for a formal announcement.
Henry, it's like, as you say it, it's such an eminently sensible suggestion. And look, we do have a dashboard that goes up to, our shareholding departments and ministers on a monthly basis. As I'm sitting here thinking about it, there's probably a couple in there we'd need to keep offline because they're sort of private lines. But for the balance of them, I can't imagine why we wouldn't do that, because I think the better informed the market is, the better you can construct your investment decisions. I'm just conscious, Jackie Bridge, our head of energy futures, often reminds me of, the history of the rhombus of regret. The people who sort of went down there, they went down there with good intent and based on a set of information, and that information changed at some point. I often wondered about whether, if that information had been a little bit more transparent, whether there might have been a different outcome. And I don't know. It's sort of somewhere between New South Vic, and I don't understand the nuance of it. I'm sure Jackie does. But yeah, it's a very sensible idea.
And I just saw Jackie write that down, Henry, so I think you're good. I'll jump back into online. It's been stated there's a significant capacity in the distribution network to connect renewables. Do you think there's too much focus on transmission connections?
Look, one of the trends that you can see very clearly with connections across the East Coast at the moment is a very distinct slowing in 66, 110, 132 and 220 kV connections. All the crops of connections coming through at the moment, as you look at them, the overwhelming majority, 275, 330 and 500. So that's sort of probably telling us that there's a lot of the sweet spots have been taken. But what I can tell you is, whether it's sort of storage or renewables, we kind of need to max out. I mean, if there's anything left there, crikey, go get it. Because we will all struggle to get the to get things at the pace that we ideally like. The only caveat I'd say on the generation side, scale does seem to be becoming pretty important. We've just noticed a very big increase in the scale of solar and wind projects coming through the turnpike, and really for all of them, they're not really looking at even at 132. They're targeting 275 as sort of the minimum ticket size, I think, for connections.
Thanks, Paul. Andy?
Thank you. I had a question about undergrounding, because we hear it a lot, but I suspect it's mostly been for the southern states. It hadn't occurred to me that it doesn't seem to be as much in Queensland. Are you getting a sense that people are wanting to see that in Queensland? Is it something you could imagine being swallowed, or is it just...
really good question. And so we, some time back, I'm going to say about 12 months ago, I think, and I need to look around and find Jerry Riley somewhere, because he was sort of shepherded this through, but we actually went to the University of Queensland and said, undergrounding can't be stupid because it exists. So there must be conditions where it actually makes sense to underground transmission lines. Go scour the planet and tell us, what those conditions are. When does it actually become important to actually do undergrounding? By the way, we don't want to lead the witness because we want the UQ logo on it. We don't. You're not to talk to Powerlink at all. You guys just come up with the work, and they overperformed. I think the report's 480 pages long, so I think the team is still trying to read through it. They got it 3 months ago.
We're trying.
Anyway, we'll try and synthesise it down. But you're right, it hasn't been a big issue in Queensland. We do have some underground transmission line because we've got some, through Cairns, of course, and we'll probably have some more going forward. But I think, most of the time, I think the sort of at its face, undergrounding sounds pretty good, but it actually has its own side of cost to one side. But also, that you can't use that land again either. It's a little bit like having a corridor in your own backyard. If you've got a telco line over there, you've got to leave access, right? So it's not like you can do anything over the top of it.
Thanks, Paul. Got time for a couple more? Thanks, Kylie.
Hi, Paul. Rachel Watson from Ox2. Great data set. I was struggling to keep up with all of the images and the information. But one question I'm left with is, given the renewable energy target you've got of 80% by 2035 or something, if you've built out all your 3 reses plus your prospective reses, and you've added in other capacity that you see in the pipe, you've got a good line of sight into what's coming down the track for renewable energy. Like, how close are you to reaching that target?
Yeah, so good question, Rachel. I love it when I get one like that too. I've got the baseball bat out ready to hit. So we've got our planners have been having an absolute ball working this one through. So actually, as it turns out, we have in our sort of pipeline, we've got 12 renewable energy zones where we've mapped them out pretty carefully. And when we look at those 12 renewable energy zones, we know that we're capable of hitting that 25 gigawatts. And then, I'm sure you would all appreciate if we go a little bit further inland, those numbers can balloon very quickly if that's where we get to. Queensland, I'm not sure how offshore we'll go. With the Great Barrier Reef, that sort of raises pretty interesting questions. The resources are a little bit more variable than they are down south. There may be some sweet spots out there. I wouldn't profess to be an expert in. What I can tell you is that renewable resources like those out near Hewenden sort of talk about world, they are unbelievable. They're unbelievable in 2 frames. Number one is they have a completely different seasonal pattern to the rest of East Coast Australia. So they blow an absolute gale in the wintertime. And for my former life in a renewable company, where every time we get to May, June, we'd be panicking about how far down the winds would drop. Out there in Hewenden, it does the exact opposite. So I think, Queensland's offshore will be inland, and that'll be really important to us. So as we start seeing those bigger loads turning up, that's where we'll need to turn. And, we're pretty confident about the resources out there, but the transmission will be a challenge, no question.
Thanks, Paul. Any other questions in the room? Otherwise, I'll jump to online. Okay, great. Paul, is there an opportunity for more coordinated procurement across transmission businesses in Australia to help with long lead items?
It's really funny, So Brett Redmond from Transgrid, he and I were asked that question, and we were sitting next together. We looked at each other, started laughing, and said, "Our engineers agree on a spec? Forget it." And I think, look, with on a more serious, I'm looking down here. I've got Sarah right in front of me, my chief engineer on all things design. She's going to kick me under the shins when I get back down there. But I think, when you think about Australian demand for transmission, whether it's transformers, reactive plant, towers, whatever the case may be, we're about 0.6 of 1% of global demand. So even if we were perfectly clubbed together, we're still nothing. And I think in some respects, we're at least in our case in Powerlink, we've got a fabulous procurement team. They're razor sharp. We still send our top engineers over to do factory acceptance testing. We don't outsource that. That actually gets us a surprising amount of kudos. I know whenever I go and speak with our suppliers from overseas, we're usually somewhere in the conversation. This is usually be somewhere in Europe or wherever, but they'll sort of say in the conversation, Powerlink reputation extends a long way beyond the shores of Australia, Paul. You guys are very well thought of, because of the information you bring back to us. If you can tell us how our assets are performing in the field and I can fix it on the screen there, it costs me a few bucks. If it gets halfway down that production queue, it costs me a couple of million. Heaven help me if it gets out in the field. I don't know what it will cost. I'm going to have to recall everything. So the fact that we're one of the few network utilities that still do that gives us a fair bit of kudos, and some of those relationships have helped us curtail some of those lead order times that you see as the boilerplate.
Thanks, Paul. I've probably got time for one more question. Any hands in the air? Okay, I'll go to online. How do you see CER and vehicle-to-grid technology impacting the grid in the long run?
Look, I think so first of all, you would hope that if we coordinate those resources and the at the consumer level well, it will keep my poor old colleague Peter Scott's pulse at a resting level, because otherwise he's going to be dealing with some horrendous peaks, and he's going to need to do a bunch of augmentations that are going to eclipse anything that they've done previously. So it'll be really important. What does it mean for the transmission networks? A little bit more nuanced, and I'll just remind you that here in Queensland, household demand is only about 20%. So even if we maxed out on that, we've still got the rest of the 80% of the economy that we're going to need to sort of service, and we can also tell you the electrification loads that are sort of starting to populate our application and inquiry pipeline are massive. They're hard to get your head around. They're numbers which are going to require us to go to that 500 kV. The last time someone had to make a call like that was in the late 1960s, moving from 132 to 275. I understand how nervous they would have been, because I've had the planners saying to me, this is what we've got to do, Paul. I'm sort of looking and thinking, really? Isn't there some other? No, there's not when you look at the electrification loads that are coming. So, in that context, I think whatever we can do with consumer energy resources, whatever we can do with EVs in terms of lightening the load across the system is going to be so important, because it's hard to manage a grid without machines with accelerators and brakes, and we'll have less of them going forward.